I was like waving back at you, Liz. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're here tonight for our final talk in our Digital Dialogues series. Digital Dialogues is a series we offer here at Myth, and we're in our 40th year, actually. You can find the entire series online, and it's a lot of information, a lot of great talks by really great people. And speaking of great people, it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Jeffrey Moro. Jeffrey Moro is here as an assistant clinical professor of digital humanities and digital studies at AADHum, which is the African American Digital and Experimental Humanities at University of Maryland and also Myth. His research addresses how artists, scientists, and laypeople alike use media to make culture out of the environment. Recent publications have appeared in the journals Digital Humanities Quarterly, Media Fields, and Journal of Environmental Media. He's also a contributor to the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's currently working on a book titled Cloud Studies, which is also cool, which explores the mediation of atmospheric phenomena as information across the media arts and sciences. Before joining AADHum, Moro completed a PhD in English with a certificate in digital studies at the University of Maryland, so one of our own, and worked as a post-baccalaureate resident with the 5-college Digital Humanities program. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Moro.
Thank you, Marissa. Oh, I'm about to cough through that water. Just give me one moment. Here we go. And thank all of you for being here today, both those of you who are here in person, those of you who are here inside the camera. I dutifully spent my Tuesdays here throughout grad school here in Myth attending Digital Dialogues, and it is a privilege and an honor to be able to be up here in front of all of y'all today. So the project that I'm going to share with y'all today is one that I've been developing over the past year for a forthcoming article in the Journal of Environmental Media in a special issue on sensing and elementality, edited by my colleagues Nick Silcox, Max Ritz, and Rafiko Ruiz. And it also anticipates some of the work towards that book project, Cloud Studies, that Marissa mentioned in my introduction. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I always feel like on paper we get to have fun epigraphs. We don't get to have them in talks as often. So I have a little epigraph for us here. Mid-September, 5:35 a.m. After hiking an hour through the crisp dark of the Schaefer Farms trailhead at the edges of Germantown, Maryland, I arrive at a cornfield, my boots soaked with early morning dew. I switch off my flashlight and rummage in my bag for my tools, a telescoping whip antenna, about 1 meter in length, a cheap pair of over-the-ear headphones, I'm a prop comedian at heart, and a small black box, scarcely bigger than my palm. I attach the antenna to a port on one end, the headphones to a port on the other. I swivel the knob, and in my ears fills a high, distant crackling like a campfire heard through the wrong end of a telescope. Twitchy musical tones slide down half steps and disappear as quickly as they arrived, and underneath there's a low, constant droning that threatens to, but never quite drowns out all of the other sounds. So this box that I brought here, and you all attended, we can pass the box around if you would like to feel the box, is a WR3 radio receiver designed to pick up on very low frequency radio signals. These are VLF radio signals ranging from 0.2 to 11 kilohertz. So for the sake of comparison, very low frequency is circled all the way over there. FM radio transmissions, the radio that in your car you're most likely to hear these days, in the United States, FM spans 88 to 108 megahertz, some 3 orders of magnitude higher in frequency than VLF. Very little of human interest happens down at this far end of the proverbial dial. Wavelengths in these regions span 1,000 meters in length or longer, impractical for anything but the most limited of military communications. So what I'm listening to with the WR3 instead is natural radio, the constant, enveloping, unpredictable electromagnetic activity of the planet Earth. Each time that lightning bursts in the Earth's atmosphere, it releases radio waves that ricochet between the planet's surface and its ionosphere, a layer of charged air lying between 80 and 1,000 kilometers over our heads. Lightning suffuses the skies with electromagnetic impulses. These radio-atmospheric signals, or sferics, the sferics of my talk's title, have haunted telecommunications from the technology's earliest days. Media historian Douglas Kahn notes that telephone conversations in the late 19th century were often interrupted by sounds both natural and man-made, as interference from weather, disasters, and competing telegraph lines threatened to drown out the voice on the other end of the wire. Listeners of a certain age may recall hearing bursts of crackling at the lowest ends of their AM radio dials, particularly at night, when sferics can intrude just high enough into the spectrum to interfere with those signals. The Earth's static, to quote sound artist Hannah Kemp Welch, sferics predate and parallel the human-made radio transmissions that have blanketed our planet for the past 150 years. That they are no longer commonplace interference in modern telecommunications means that you all are now a member of a very small coterie of individuals who have even heard of them, much less actually heard their strange arcing static in action. Nevertheless, sferics remain of interest to a diverse audience of electrical engineers, amateur radio enthusiasts, atmospheric scientists, and sound and media artists, forming a small but vibrant community that I have come to term spherologists. We're academics, we get to make our own words. Among spherologists, distinctions between the arts and sciences of seeking, recording, and interpreting sferics blur, as enthusiasts pass around plans for antennae, share choice listening spots, create extensive field recordings, and even manufacture devices such as the WR3, which is somewhere out there in the crowd right now, in an effort to make natural radio, a niche hobby within a niche hobby, more accessible to the listening public. So, I came to spherology through a broader research interest in how environmental phenomena, particularly those originating from the Earth's atmosphere, are mediated as information through both technical and cultural practices. In this work, I join scholars of environmental media studies such as Yuriko Furuhata, Sarah Grossman, and Nicole Starosielski in exploring how atmospheric phenomena such as weather patterns, climate control, and thermal energies become legible as data within scientific, industrial, and aesthetic pursuits. Sferics pose useful theoretical and methodological challenges for this kind of work in that they stubbornly resist sensibility, much less assimilation, into contemporary regimes of informatic signification. Apart from a few applications in lightning detection, sferics have no immediate use to scientific or industrial enterprise. They surround us and our media at all times, yet with advances in cable shielding and noise filtering, even their days as common interference are far behind them. Nevertheless, it is precisely sferics' elusiveness that inspires a concomitant passion for them in spherologists, who often must go to great physical lengths to hear them amidst the buzzing din of contemporary electrified life. After their initial scientific discovery in the early 20th century, which we'll talk about later on in this talk, spherics fell into relative obscurity for decades, until a coterie of sound artists began incorporating them into their work in the 1970s and the 1980s. For these artists, spherics and other naturally occurring electromagnetic phenomena are fulcrums for which to consider what Douglas Kahn has termed earth energies in contemporary media cultures, connections between arts practices, technoculture, and the planet itself. On the media studies side, folks like UC Parika and Janine Randerson have mapped similar connections for the media arts and natural sciences for the fields of geology and meteorology, respectively. And in many ways, this talk is an attempt to map such similar kinds of connections for naturally occurring electromagnetism. So, my argument is this, as I believe in being very clear about it. De-emphasized in contemporary technoscience, spherology takes refuge in the media arts. There, even as artists idealize spherics as a direct path to a kind of planetary unconscious, there remain attempts to incorporate spherics within existing cultural models of data. These models insist that environmental phenomena, no matter how immaterial, serve some aspect of human productivity. In short, the pursuit of spherics in media arts is also the pursuit of their use value. To make this argument over the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to explore a range of sonic, visual, and radio artists who incorporate spherics into their work in a variety of ways, with an emphasis on the media techniques that they use to listen to, record, and transmute spherics. And just a little bit of methodological legerdemain here. By invoking technique, I'm situating my work here today within what media scholar Grant Withoff has characterized as a recent shift in media studies as a field away from the study of discrete devices, so this is the focus of something like media archaeology, for instance, and towards cultures and practices of use. Here, strategies drawn from diverse intellectual traditions, from the anthropological Chien operatoire to the Kulturtechniken of German media theorists such as Bernhard Siegert or Cornelia Wissmann, emphasize not only the what of mediation, but also the how. Technique, I've found, is a particularly useful hermeneutic for the study of spherics, given how much of their listening practice involves improvisation, invention, and the non-standard use of media technologies. So, we're going to take the rest of this talk in two parts. The first is going to examine techniques for mediating spherics as numerical data, and then the second is going to talk about narrative data. So, let's go ahead and dive in. So, Act 1. In 1919, fresh from the wreckage of the First World War, a German physicist named Heinrich Barkhausen published a paper describing two novel environmental noises. The first, since christened Barkhausen noise, is a minute crackling sound caused by magnetic domains within the crystal lattice of materials such as iron when they're brought into alignment. Magnetizing metal literally makes a sound. That's what that is. And this is a device that Barkhausen used to magnetize the metal and then hook it up to a receiver. That's the first sound. The second sound, which Barkhausen himself noted in a later paper, quote, aroused but little interest at the time of the first publication, was what he called whistling tones from the earth, strange howling noises heard on telegraph wires, which interfered with communicative signals. Science now recognizes these tones as emerging not from the earth, but from the air. We call them spherics. Barkhausen heard these mysterious tones on the battlefront while attempting to tap Allied telephone conversations. His system, which employed ground cables driven into the dirt, had the capacity to detect messages sent on then unshielded cable wires running throughout the trenches. It was also open, as were the cables themselves because of the lack of shielding, to natural radio interference. Barkhausen was unsure as to these sounds' causes. He speculated that they were interference from the amplifier itself, but that couldn't account for how the tones seemed responsive to, quote, meteorological influences, occurring more commonly on warmer and wetter days than on cooler and drier ones, and we live here in DC. What happens on warm and wet days? There's a thunderstorm. By the 1930s, Barkhausen had settled on lightning as the most likely cause, an explanation further ratified by later experimental observation in the 50s. So I tell this story to highlight a habitual distinction, common both to electrical engineering and media studies, between human-generated electromagnetism as signal, thus meaningful, and natural electromagnetic phenomena as noise, and thus interference. What I want to do now is explore a couple of projects that invert this distinction, that seek to make spherics mean something, in this case, as sources of randomness or entropy. Entropy is a concept that cuts across a variety of fields from thermodynamics to information theory, and the word carries slightly different denotations depending on the field in question, but a common denominator across them all is the idea that entropy measures a degree of uncertainty or disorder in a given system. For spherics, we'll look at how software engineers and artists turn to techniques of spherological listening as a way to generate random numbers for a range of cryptographic applications, from cryptocurrency to straight-up gambling. The consequences of these applications are thus to assimilate spherics into the informatic regime of finance capitalism, whereby everything, even meaninglessness, contains some potential use value. So, one of computer science's perennial struggles is the generation of random numbers. Humans and computers alike are notoriously bad at random number generation, or RNG. Both of our brains, so to speak, are just too wired to pre-existing patterns. Humans will fall back on subconscious favorites, while computer software can definitionally only generate numbers from programmed rules, which, no matter how complex, can at least theoretically be reproduced and backwards engineered. This is what statisticians call pseudo-RNG. Now, pseudo-RNG is sufficient for a number of day-to-day applications. Indeed, it might even be desirable in certain settings. Say, for instance, you're testing some software and you want to have a string of random numbers that you can reproduce over and over and over again as you're testing the software. Having pseudo-RNG that begins from the same seed data would be really useful in that regard. But some applications, such as cryptography, work best with true random numbers, especially when one desires a high level of informational security. Now, unlike pseudo-RNG, which can rely on computational algorithms, true RNG has to derive its values from stochastic natural processes, such as radioactive decay, Brownian motion, this is the random motion of particles in a fluid such as air, or the atmospheric noise of spherics. So the aptly named website random.org, which you are all welcome to go to right now, has since 1998 provided web users with true random numbers by listening into low-end radio static. Run by Mads Haar, a professor in the School of Computer Science and Statistics at Trinity College Dublin, random.org began from work on a computational engine for online gambling, which Haar quickly realized would require true random numbers so as to protect against manipulative strategies such as card counting. Quote, "The first version of the program," Haar writes, "was based on a $10 radio receiver from Radio Shack, one that needed to be so cheap so as to not have any kind of noise filtration removing static in between stations." Over the subsequent years, Haar's noise detection system has grown in complexity, upgrading from 1 to 2 and then 3 radios, and then in 2009, he switched to a globally distributed series of nodes, radios, in various locations worldwide. This makes random.org, in turn, a more sustainable system for HAR's primary goal with the project, selling random numbers. Random.org now offers true random numbers at various price points for a range of applications. As of this writing, 10 million random integers will set you back $61.09. If you want 10,000 random alphanumeric strings, that'll be a cool $214.14. I see some of you being like, I have a new side hustle. It's not much, perhaps, but it's a tidy profit off of whistling tones. Sferics' capacity as an engine of randomness has also found applications in the world of cryptocurrency. So, in April of 2023, media artist Matt Delorier used field recordings captured with a WR3 radio receiver as seed data for cryptographic contributions to the Ethereum Foundation's KZG ceremony, a collective initiative worldwide to improve the cryptocurrency Ethereum's scalability through novel random number contributions. These random numbers then form a cryptographic base for Ethereum's ceremony. Contains a cryptic note reading, "Whispers from the shadows tell of a powerful spirit Dankshard who will open the next chapter of Ethereum's scalability. Contributors have come together to summon its power." Now, Dankshard, which is a very cryptocurrency word, refers to an Ethereum design technique for taking large databases and partitioning them into smaller databases, like making shards of something. I guess because it's crypto, it's got to be dank. In this regard, random numbers function as a conceptual suture between the world of cryptographic rationality and the world of the immanent, even the divine. Delorier describes his spherological field recordings as, quote, alternative sources of random entropy, which he plans to continue to collect as seeds for future artworks. By integrating spherical entropy into the very infrastructure of a cryptocurrency, Delorier's recordings transform natural phenomena into scalable resources for the work of financialization. So, before we dig deeper into this conceptual and material translation of spherics into numbers, it's important to pause for a moment to distinguish what we actually mean by listening to spherics. Strictly speaking, one cannot listen to spherics at all. Spherics aren't sounds, they're electromagnetic radiation, and we don't have a body part to sense electromagnetic radiation. This puts spherologists in the curious position of listening not to sound, but to light. There we go. And this is the cover of a very influential book among spherologists in the 1970s, Calvin Graff's Listen to Radio, Energy, Light, and Sound. It's a series of, he was an electrical engineer, a series of basically a how-to kit for constructing the early versions of things that would later become stuff like the WR3 radio receiver. So, a VLF receiver, like the WR3, functions the same as any traditional radio receiver. Its antenna picks up on electromagnetic waves and then uses those waves as instructions to vibrate the diaphragm of the speaker in the headphones, such that the speaker produces pressure waves in the air that we can hear. Sound studies reminds us that recorded sound is better thought of as reproduced sound. The same movement from phenomenon to instruction to reproduction happens in the instantaneity of radio. There is therefore a formal correspondence between electromagnetic waves and air pressure waves, even as they're not the same thing. Here's the part where it starts to get fun. Traditional radio, as we've noted, employs frequencies significantly higher than the range of human hearing. Human hearing spans about 20 hertz to 20,000 kilohertz, way down here. Using principles of modulation, high-frequency carrier signals can encode instructions for audible signals, which are in turn decoded by a radio receiver. This is how the radio in your car works. But with spherics, there are no carrier signals. just signals. Moreover, lightning releases energy across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. That's why you can see it as light. What we hear of spherics at all are only those frequencies that lie within the human audible range, converted directly into pressure waves without any other kind of modification beyond basic decibel gain, just making them louder. To cut through some of this technical legerdemain, the only slice of what we hear of lightning in the WR3 is determined by our bodies. Even spherics themselves, indeed, the practice of VLF listening more generally, spherics are made sensible by the happy accident of those frequencies lying within the same mathematical form as the human audible range. So, to come back a little bit to our artists. Delorier's work thereby goes one step further, mediating sound recordings into random numbers through computational process. With its gestures to the sublime and the divine, the Ethereum network tells a particular kind of story about the relationship between random numbers and its cryptocurrency. And it goes a little something like this. Unearthed from the primordial chaos of nature and converted into information, these true random numbers will permit Ethereum's flourishing and, crucially, its scaling, the indefinite growth that capitalism mandates. In telling this story, Ethereum makes claims on spherical entropy as a kind of natural infrastructure for its operations. And this is a great phrase that I did not come up with. Natural infrastructure is a concept under consideration in a range of current environmental disciplines. Sociologist Andrew Barry, for instance, argues for the Earth itself as, quote, integral to the ongoing existence of human infrastructure, albeit itself a base that is, quote, neither static nor stable, but rather a further source of instability for infrastructures, end quote. In this position, the Earth has an existence distinct from human infrastructures, which nevertheless influences and shapes their communicative and organizational capacity. If spherics are a natural informatic infrastructure, it's only because we have made them so. Spherics can only serve as a cryptographic base after being subject to various mediatic procedures, none of which are fluid nor straightforward. By passing through sound, something legible to the human sensorium, even the numbers that Haar and Delorier draw from spherics bear the trace of human perspective. The radio receiver, as a technology, fits electromagnetism to human scale. Moreover, it makes electromagnetism available to human use. Underneath spherological entropy lies a cultural logic of the planet as a resource, the anthropocentric utility of which gets continually reaffirmed through the application of media techniques that make equivalent planetary phenomena and abstract structures of capital. Environmental media scholars such as Mel Hogan and Asta Vonderau have addressed the environmental externalities of cryptocurrency, which, as a technology, relies on resource exploitation on a massive scale. Now, spherological entropy doesn't lie neatly under these previous rubrics of extraction or pollution. There's no removal of resources, for instance, and there's no destructive externalities as such. However, this work, I argue, serves an important conceptual function in shoring up the very idea of the planet as a resource. This conceptual operation, in turn, depends on media techniques that fit environmental phenomena, such as electromagnetism, to the human scale of sensation. What gets left out is, quite literally, useless. That's the end of Act 1. I also realized that my notes got printed weirdly askew, so I just needed to take a second to make sure good. The rest of my notes are the way they are. Wonderful. So we've been talking about numbers a lot, and now I want to start talking about sounds more. On a late August evening, 62 years after Heinrich Barkhausen first described his whistling tones, so we're in the mid-80s, American experimental composer Alvin Lucier climbed a mountain in central Colorado and recorded the sky. Lucier, a composer whose work often concerns the material and acoustic properties of sound itself, spent weeks in the Colorado wilderness attempting to make recordings of spherics in the hopes of using them in a piece. It wasn't his first exposure to natural radio, to be clear. 14 years earlier, in 1967, he performed a piece called Whistlers at the first Festival of Live Electronic Music in San Diego, which remediated spherics recorded by a Dartmouth physicist who released an LP of these sounds in 1955 called Ionosphere, which is a really cool LP. Nor was it Lucier's first attempt at listening to spherics in the field. Shortly after that festival, he joined electronic music pioneer Pauline Oliveros in an expedition just outside of San Diego to seek them out. But the expedition was inconclusive, the technology just wasn't right, and the interference from the electrical grid, a perennial opponent of spherologists, was way too loud. Lucier set spherics aside until 1981, when during his Colorado trip, he finally got a clear recording, 8 minutes and 12 seconds of which he released in 1988 as the standalone piece, Sferics. Like most BLF recordings, Sferics is perversely unlistenable. Blips, squawks, squeaks occupy the middle register, while faint falling tones intermix in the background. Persistent high tones repeat in something that threatens to, but never really quite comes together in a kind of descant ostinato. Lucier's recording transports his subject from the realm of pure science into that of aesthetics. There is, of course, scientific interest to Sferics, the art piece, as each sound corresponds to some atmospheric disturbance loosed on the magnetosphere. But in this recording, Lucier ushers natural radio out of the exclusive purviews of environmental science and electrical engineering and into that of the sound arts. Earlier pieces of Lucier's similarly leverage scientific concepts towards aesthetic ends. Music for Solo Performer, for instance, which is from 1965, translates a performer's brain waves into sound. Meanwhile, he also has I Am Sitting in a Room from 1969, where he repeats the phrase, I am sitting in a room, while inside of a room, recording the feedback over and over and over again until it washes out into white noise of the room itself. While Sferics doesn't initiate artistic interest in natural radio, it nevertheless represents a distinct era in natural radio listening culture, wherein technologies of listening become accessible not just to professional scientists, but to amateurs and artists alike. And there is a picture of me out in the field. Whereas the previous section of this talk explored Sferics' numerical information, we're turning now to the narrative. My interest is in field recordings of Sferics as a genre in contemporary media arts. For these spherologists, field recordings serve as records of their conditions of capture as much as, if not more than, recordings of Sferics themselves. As sound artist Yolanda Harris has argued, field recordings can serve an important function in, quote, establishing relationships to place through listening, although one that is, to continue the quote, laden with assumptions about the context and portability of such relationships. Following Harris's lead, I want to ask now what spherologists are listening for in their field recording practices. And I'm going to argue that even as spherologists frame their field recordings as sublime escapes from the human-built technological surround, a refuge in the natural world, their recordings, nevertheless, demand that Sferics serve a representative function, encoding information about the world and humanity's effects on it. Now, before we dive into some of these recordings themselves, I want to pause for a moment, do a little bit more tech, to discuss the different kinds of Sferics that you hear on these recordings. Like clouds or demons, for that matter, Sferics over the years have required a quite rigorous taxonomy. Different kinds of Sferics have different wave paths through the atmosphere, and subsequently, different sonic signatures upon conversion from radio to sound wave. So the word Sferics itself actually refers to fundamental units of atmospheric radio noise, sounding like this. So by far, the most common sounds one hears in a VLF receiver. Sferics are short, crackling noises. Let's not pour water all over things. Short, crackling noises caused by lightning bursts that occur within a few thousand kilometers of the listener. These bursts travel along the waveguide formed by the Earth's surface and its ionosphere, bouncing up and down between the air and the Earth. When spherics travel more than a couple thousand of kilometers along this waveguide, their frequencies get attenuated in a process called dispersion. This causes higher frequencies to reach the listener slightly faster than the lower ones, and the result is a sound called a tweak, which takes on a distinctly musical character. You can hear the sliding of the high to low. One can best hear tweaks at night due to changes in the Earth's ionosphere in the absence of the sun. Among the most sought-after atmospheric signals and the rarest are called whistlers. They're even further dispersed than tweaks. They sound a little bit something like this. That whoo! So these are caused by spherics that travel away from the Earth's surface, out into space along the field lines of the magnetosphere, resulting in a lengthy falling tone similar to the whooshes one might hear from an alien spaceship in a 50s sci-fi movie. Now, spherology owes many of the clearest sonic examples of spherics, tweaks, and whistlers to a man named Stephen P. McGreevy, whose influence looms large over contemporary natural radio. He's a very nice man. He responded to a number of my emails. Looms large over contemporary natural radio listening. Born in San Francisco in 1963, McGreevy was from his teen years an avid radio enthusiast, particularly in the art of DXing, or making distant contact with radio stations across the world. In the 80s, McGreevy struck up a friendship with a video artist named Michael Middeke, who for a time lived in a remote ranch in the Santa Lucia Mountains south of Big Sur in California. Due to its isolation from human-made interference, the ranch made for a perfect location for uninterrupted spherics listening, a hobby that Middeke introduced to McGreevy. Today, McGreevy is famous in the hobby for three principal contributions. The first is his indefatigable promotion of natural radio listening as a hobby in and of itself. The second is the development of his WR3 radio receiver, which is somewhere out there right now. The WR3 was the first VLF receiver designed around a whip antenna, that's the big long antenna on a boombox, rather than hundreds of meters of wire, thereby making natural radio listening both portable and accessible to a general audience. And you can buy the WR3 on eBay. It runs about $160, $170. The third is his long-standing listening and recording practice, which has generated hundreds of hours of tape footage of spherics. And the clearest of these recordings form the basis for two compact disc releases: Electric Enigma, the VLF recordings of Stephen P. McGreevy, and that's from 1996, and Auroral Chorus 2, there is, to my knowledge, no Auroral Chorus 1, The Music of the Magnetosphere from 2000. Okay. We'll listen to a track from Electric Enigma. If you think, by the way, that sounds a little bit like bird song, you're not wrong. That is a recording of what's called the dawn chorus. In birding, the dawn chorus is the sound of when all of the birds wake up in the morning and you can hear them. In fact, this past Sunday was International Dawn Chorus Day among birders. The dawn chorus also is used in natural radio listening. It's the sound of sunrise hitting the atmosphere, and that's what it happens to sound like on the VLF. It's a happy accident. It sort of sounds like birds. Tracks on Electric Enigma and Auroral Chorus 2 take their names from the location of their capture. Titles such as Alvord Desert Auroral Chorus, which we actually just listened to, Slow Falling Alberta Whistlers, and Kenai Crazy Whistlers ground their sounds in specific places, even as the Sferics themselves traveled thousands of kilometers to reach McGreevy's antenna. Place is vital to spherology. Due to electrical grid interference and physical architecture, Sferics are nigh impossible to hear in most urban areas, requiring spherologists to travel well outside the limits of human development to capture their recordings. To solve these challenges, McGreevy captures much of his recordings on his bespoke WR4B system, which is a 10-foot-long copper wire hooked up to a tape deck in a camper van. And he can use this to not only to produce recordings of greater sensitivity than a handheld system, but moreover, it allows him to record hours of footage while sleeping for later review. For McGreevy, natural radio listening is inseparable from the experience of nature itself. In the extensive liner notes to Electric Enigma, he writes, "This September 17, 1993 morning, we were having a nice time parked once again in the beautiful high desert, surrounded by beautiful mountains, pungent sagebrush, whistlers roaring in the headphones, and few cares in the world." Spherology for McGreevy is a meditative practice. He later says, quote, that like stargazing, it redirects the mind and heart toward the wonder and beauty of the natural world. Now, environmental humanities scholars such as Rob Nixon, for instance, have critiqued the notion of nature as a sublime escape from technologized modernity, as one rooted in colonial fantasies of untouched land, available for both contemplation and control by urban subjects. McGreevy sites are predominantly in the American and Canadian West, far from electrical infrastructure, yes, but not far from indigenous land dispossession and the vagaries of petrocapitalism. The very conditions that make these sites suitable for natural radio listening are not in themselves natural, but rather contingent outcomes of historical processes such as colonization and resource extraction. By marking his recordings with the names of these sites, McGreevy asks Sferics, I suggest, to speak for and to these places, reaffirming the fantasy of an untouched natural world outside of human development. Subsequent sound artists have attempted to more fully engage this contradiction between Sferics as a fantasy of natural escape and their entanglement with human technical systems. We might characterize these spherologists that we're about to talk about as a kind of third wave, right? If we think of a first wave of spherologists from roughly the 20s to the 50s, who are mostly scientists, and then a wave of sound artists from the 70s through the 90s, we sort of now have a third wave. To a degree more so than either Lucier or McGreevy, third-wave spherologists emphasize VLF listening as a political practice. For example, media artist Dan Tapper has, since 2013, produced several works bearing on Sferics and VLF more generally. Projects such as 2013's Recording the Spirit Level deliberately bring together natural radio and human-made signals, flattening distinctions between one as meaningful and the other as interference. As the title, Recording the Spirit Level, suggests, Sferics still can't seem to escape sublimity or mysticism. Even as Tapper himself actually goes to great lengths to demystify the practice, he's published a couple of pamphlets for other sound artists interested in doing VLF work. In fact, as you walked in, if you saw some of the hula hoops that we have over out there in Myth, that's part of a recipe that he put together for a loop antenna for the listening of Sferics, a kind of ad hoc loop antenna. Other artists attempt more overtly politicized readings of Sferics, and you can see here the loop antenna that I'm talking about. Hannah Kemp-Welch's 2018 piece Full of Noises uses a VLF induction loop and a ribbon antenna to record low-frequency signals throughout the Lake District in Cumbria, England. For Kemp-Welch, VLF listening is specifically grounded in places of place and access to airwaves. She writes, quote, "I'm imagining possibilities for a future citizen watchdog, allowing residents to use DIY VLF receivers to make audible the underwater military operations that surround them," end quote, which recalls similar kinds of investigations into technologies of surveillance undertaken by artists such as Haroon Faraki or Trevor Paglen. The desire to expose the inner workings of technical apparatuses is one shared across a range of impulses in media arts and criticisms, recalling what art historian Nick Mirzoff has called the right to look, or the emancipatory power of seeing occluded systems. Nevertheless, Sferics can't neatly illustrate either natural or technical infrastructure. On a material level, as we've discussed, there is no correspondence between spherics captured at a place and the place itself. They simply travel too long and too far, and the routes of their travel are nigh impossible to chart. But more to the point, the media techniques through which we access spherics are intrinsically bound to anthropocentric frames of human sensation. What these artists uncover then, I would suggest, is less a wonder of the natural world and more the definitional limits and capacities of the human sensorium. But that search compels spherologists to return to the field time and again. And listening to Sferics, I did it one night I dragged my wife Sky, who's in attendance today, out at 3 in the morning to listen to Sferics. I only did it the one time. It's hard work. As these spherologists' work demonstrates, natural radio listening entails having to think about and physically relate to electromagnetic infrastructure in a concerted way. It entails figuring out where power lines are and how powerful their emissions are. It entails waking up in the dead of night to travel to far-flung locations, perhaps even ones where you're technically not really supposed to be at that hour. When McGreevy narrates his own listening practice, a not insignificant amount of his interest goes to his own lack of sleep, in fact. Quote, "Many of those Sunday mornings would have been better spent sleeping a few hours longer, but oh, was I so glad when those whistlers would be pouring forth in my receiver's headphones as another gorgeous sunrise was coming up, then I was always glad I made the effort to get up early," end quote. These field recordings might not be able to capture as much as they would like to claim sometimes about the places and methods of their capture, but what they do encode, I would venture, is a record of that search itself. As we come to the close of this talk, I want to go back to mid-September, 6:45 a.m. The eastern sky has begun to glow orange and white with the light of the rising sun. By time at Schaefer Farms draws to a close, the realities of waking up at 3 a.m. have begun to hit. Over the lingering crackles of Sferics in my headphones, the odd tweak or here or there letting loose from its thousands of kilometers away, I begin to hear sounds of cars on the road about a mile or so off. As I hike back from the cornfield to the parking lot, I pass a handful of mountain bikers out on their early morning rides through the thickets of dew. I make private plans, finally, to get myself out west, to the echoing silence of the Mojave, or perhaps far north, to those distant parts of Alberta, where McGreevy recorded cascades of whistlers, far more than I could ever hope to hear here on the East Coast. I begin to understand, not just intellectually, but also physically, in my bones, how spherology can drive one to the most unusual places. So this talk has explored that spherological drive to make meaning from even the most obscure of environmental phenomena. Across numerical and narrative registers, that meaning emerges through the application of media techniques of utility, whereby spherics come to serve an informational function otherwise belied by their insensible materiality. In many ways, this talk has been an investigation into the limits of sensibility for environmental phenomena, and the role of media in shifting that which lies beyond the realm of embodied perception into some fashion of view, or in this case, hearing. For environmental media studies, this investigation prompts two avenues for further consideration, as I see it. The first is the role of sensation, not only in the production and use of environmental information more generally, but furthermore in our choices of subjects for scholarly analysis. Sferics point to a lively world of non-anthropocentric environmental phenomena and mediation that are now beginning to come under more thorough consideration. And the second is the necessity of an environmental media critique that extends beyond articulating media's ecological impact or the materiality of its mediation towards further analysis of how techniques, broadly construed, reinforce regimes of both signification and power. We are constantly surrounded by spherics, but would never know it without the techniques of industrial modernity. What spherics can then mean is then often all too synonymous with what use they can serve that modernity, from the entropic infrastructure of cryptocurrency to the place-based narration of field recordings. But however partial and imperfect the view, spherological listening affords a rare glimpse at that most elusive of wonders, the Earth without us. The task that remains for us is learning how to listen. Thank you. We have about 25 minutes or so for questions, both from folks in the room, and I know we have some moderation for any questions coming in from online. Hey, folks. Bring it on. I've got this article that the talk is based on is going to be coming out this summer, apparently, the fastest scholarly, it was a year from the initial idea of it being published, which I'm just like, oh, I better not get used to this, right? But there's a lot in the project that obviously I had to leave out that I would love to talk more about, and any other sort of questions at all. Fire away. Yeah, Lisa.
Thank you. This is really interesting for me. And I like what you said in the conclusion. You said that we are surrounded by spirits, so we may not exactly know what it is. And I find that very useful because when I watched Black Panther Wakanda Forever, I thought about the use of sound in the beginning on the thing on the ocean, where the Taliban came up. They used the sound to disrupt. I remember going to go see that. Because I'm not a Marvel person, but I did see Wakanda Forever with many of my coworkers. But can you explain a little bit more what happens in the moment? In the moment, I believe there's the use of spherics to disrupt their cognitive ability, so they can't think so much, and then the Taliban come aboard wherever they are, it's a ship or something, the rail, something of that nature. And that's what happens. So I'm wondering how, in a film like Black Panther, you can sort of engage with, how do you call it, spherical or sphere.
It's hard to say.
Spherology.
Yeah.
That kind of knowledge. I don't know, because it's also, I think, because it's from the Taliban and they are sort of like layer beams that are on the ocean. It's sort of like a natural phenomenon that happens. So I don't know. It's just giving me a lot of vocabulary to think about work like that. Because when I watched it, I was like, yeah, this is something, but I didn't have the words to describe what was going on.
Yeah, I think what that makes me think of, thank you, Lisa, and this is something that I've gotten in doing this project a lot more interested in trying to think of different ways to sort of theorize from my vantage point in environmental media studies, and that's the idea of interference, right? Earlier drafts of this project leaned a little bit more heavily on, and there's some stuff in the article that I cut for time, on the sort of classical discussion in media studies around signal and noise, right? And how, and I've followed with interest work both recent and not so recent. So here I'm thinking of precisely, at the beginning of Bernhard Ziegert, who's a German media theorist. He wrote a book called Cultural Techniques that's been quite influential for me in conceptualizing my work. But the first chapter of that book, he offers the argument that the demarcation of signal from noise, of meaningfulness from meaninglessness, is the line in the sand that constitutes information as such, right? And I become very interested in sort of how these questions of interference play out in a range of both media arts and scientific pursuits. So I think that the Black Panther example is, I think, a really interesting and useful one, just sort of the way you're mapping it out for us, that there is this habitual association of interference and the natural world, right? That humans are doing one thing over here, and if we could just shut the annoying planet out, right? And what I find really compelling about spherical listening, about natural radio listening, is that it's doing precisely the opposite. That it's saying, let's take all of these things that are habitually thought of as annoying interruptions, interference, and instead bring them into the frame of aesthetics, right? Which I think is just a sort of really compelling project for thinking about also even framing around environmentalism, right? It asks us to take the planet seriously in a different kind of way. Carrie, I saw your hands.
That was just riveting, Jeffrey. I just absolutely loved it. And I'm fascinated by the idea of a taxonomy of spherology. And I'm just wondering...
I feel like I put that one in for you.
So I'm wondering about just how exhaustive McGreevy's methods are, if he's been so thorough that there's no work to be done anymore on the taxonomy front, or if there are still opportunity for contributions to be made. If there's something beyond the blips, squeaks, tweaks, whistlers, and cracklings.
Yeah. So to clarify, that taxonomy is not McGreevy's own invention. It is one that atmospheric scientists have... I will say it's not entirely scientific, right? One of the things that's really quite interesting about, and it's been really just sort of a wonderful experience working on this project, is that there's really very little distinction in natural radio culture, because it's such a small world, between the artists over here and the scientists over here. Everyone's kind of doing the same thing. Everyone has a little bit of training in one or the other, and there's a kind of mishmash here. So I think you can even see that in the words of tweak, whistler, blip, that are onomatopoeic, that are evocative in a way that we typically don't find in a lot of, apologies, scientific discourse. So in that regard, I would say that, just to clarify, it's not McGreevy's alone. There are a little bit more refinedness, but to my knowledge, I have yet to uncover a more rigorous taxonomy beyond sort of the ones that I laid out for you. So I definitely think that there is ample work for a more thorough descriptive project. I will say the two other kinds that are often sort of discussed that I didn't share. One was the dawn chorus that I did mention. There's also the auroral chorus. This is a sort of dream of mine, is getting out to Alaska to be able, or Iceland or something again, to be able to listen, because you can listen to the aurora too. It's got its own electromagnetic signature. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful, right? Even just conceptually. Thankfully, auroral and dawn chorus do sound fairly nice. Some of the other stuff doesn't sound super nice. But yeah, to answer the question, I think that there's ample room for a further taxonomic project. And if anyone's looking for like a grant or something to do some weird sound art, I'm right there with you. Marissa.
So, excuse me. I'm thinking about some of this and backtracking a little bit. This is so fascinating. And I'm thinking about the sort of point you made about signal and noise, right? But let me ask you the thing we're not talking about. But I'm thinking about signal and noise.
I'm ready.
Right? Oh my God. But thinking about signal and noise and the sort of point you're making about sort of, and just correct me.
Yeah.
Right? Sort of what matters with large and what doesn't.
Absolutely.
Right? And it becomes a way of also thinking about the human and the not human, right? Or human and the earth. But I was thinking how, one of the things we see happening so often in animal research, example I was giving my class, right? Where we imagine that the octopus has no brain, but it turns out we didn't know where to look. Right? And it's actually that plain, you're kind of like, oh, duh.
Is it
right?
It's
It's all over, it's distributed, right? It's amazing. It's like a suit is a brain, right? So I can imagine something similar with electromagnetism, because, and this is my personal example, quote marks, of course, it was that moment where like your cat's dying out and you're looking for your cat and you're like, I'm gonna clap for my cat, I'm gonna call for my cat, but tune out for the cat, because clearly the cat can smell its way home. You know, like everyone go outside, like wave your bodies. But of course it turns out that cats mainly navigate by electromagnetism. Almost every animal that migrates, right? Or can find its way home across thousands of miles, cats, they actually do it by electromagnetism. So it's also the sense that we're in fact surrounded by signals that we don't actually have access to, right? I'm struck by your point about techniques, right? And so I was just thinking a little bit about, you know, putting that into play, or asking you to put that into play, even just with the idea of sentiment.
Absolutely.
Or the idea of knowledge. I think there's just something so compelling here, because your point and the way it's framed here, of course, absolutely stands. But it's also so fascinating how it's not a division, again, of signal and noise. It's actually just all about all the things that we don't even know how to know about.
Precisely. Yeah, it's the unknown, right? To sort of like go to Donald Rumsfeld's famous known knowns and right, such thing. Absolutely. So I'm gonna just say briefly what this is, why I put this up here. This is a very, very famous diagram in media studies and information theory from Claude Shannon's 1960, originally in the 40s, republished in the 60s, The Mathematical Theory of Communication. This is a text that stands alongside Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics as a kind of core text of information theory and cybernetics. And this is essentially his model of how communication works, that it begins from a source to a transmitter. Strange things happen here at the moment of mediation, including the intrusion of noise, receiver, decoding. So just want to frame why this is up here. But to Marissa's question, I think absolutely I'm really glad that you brought in the category specifically of the human and the non-human, right? In terms of electromagnetic sensing, you're absolutely right that we're learning a lot of quite staggering things about non-human capacity for sensing. So for instance, migratory birds. This is I did a little bit of work on birds in the fall for a conference. So I learned a few bird facts. Migratory birds, there are a number of species that have found to have essentially small pieces of like iron in their beaks that essentially are magnetized. Like they have a magnetic organ. And this is something that a number of scientists, and I don't have sort of the full breadth of this research on hand, but a number of scientists are starting to think about the capacity. Obviously, we can think of animals like the electric eel are communicating in some capacity using electromagnetism, they have the capacity to build up and release charges. Essentially, the way you flex a muscle, an electric eel can flex and release an electric organ, right? But I think that another thing that is interesting that there's been more recent work on media studies around, and I'm thinking here of the work of Rahul Mukherjee, who's up at Penn right now. He has a really wonderful book called Radiant Infrastructures, which is about the infrastructures in question are radiation-emitting human-made infrastructures. And his case study work is mostly in the Indian subcontinent. And he's looking at principally nuclear reactors and cell phone towers, and the ways that these radiant infrastructures, as he puts them, construe various kinds of media publics, people who imagine themselves as imagine or are quite literally affected by these technologies in various ways, whether that is in the sort of like, exposure to, we think about something like the Bhopal disaster, right? That is a sort of touchstone in environmental studies more generally, right? Like, exposure to radiation from a reactor is going to have a real and present effect. There's also the question of whether or not cell phone radiate. We all remember sort of the, like, is cell phones going to give us brain cancer kind of moment, right? But this broader question of, and the studies are probably not, but I guess we'll find out in about 75 years, right? And unfortunately, a lot of things in science are that. That's the answer, which is quite unsettling. But when we think about, so he has some recent work that I followed with interest on electrosensitivity disorder. So these are folks who imagine themselves to be impacted by modern electromagnetism in various ways. They may feel that they are sensitive to cell phones, so like a cell phone tower will go up near their house and they'll begin to start experiencing splitting headaches. Or they'll think they believe that like 5G cell phone, this is again this sort of dovetails with conspiratorial thinking about like is 5G going to like, you know, unleash the woke mind virus or something. It's this fascinating space, right, where on the one hand, electrosensitivity disorder does not exist. Like Wi-Fi can't hurt you, right? It's not real. It is real, but it can't hurt you. On the other hand, we do have people who, at the very least, believe themselves to be impacted, or at the very least are impacted by something in a way and are searching for answers, right? And that's culture, right? And that's interesting, and their plight. So it's sort of like with other kinds of sort of unexplained, inexplicable medical phenomena. Like, just because it doesn't comport with a dominant understanding of the human body doesn't mean that there's not something happening. 100 years ago, we thought that, or about 150 years ago, we thought that disease spread by miasma, and then we figured out what germs were. So it's entirely possible to circle back to Marissa's point here that we may or may not actually find that the human body does have some capacious response in some fashion or another to electromagnetism. And I think that one thing that natural radio listening helps frame for us is, and this is sort of, you know, it can be a little hokey at times, but I actually, you know, I feel like you're not in this business unless you're at least a little bit hokey about something in some ways. It really does attune us. It has the capacity to attune us to this lively world of electromagnetism that, because it's something that we don't think we can sense, we just assume it doesn't exist at all. And that's the moment to bring it back to your question of also sort of like meaningfulness, right? That's a way to bring it into the frame of, no, this is a thing. This is composed as a thing. We create it, and now we actually have to fit it into our view of the world. And how does our view of the world change when we think about, I'll say this last thing and then I'll sort of come to the end of this little answer. I think of a very famous, maybe even infamous, concept in earth science and also sort of a spilled over into critical theory, James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. And this was an idea. So James Lovelock is, and James Lovelock and Paul Kreutzer are two scientists who helped sort of popularize the word Anthropocene, which we don't hear so much anymore. We heard a lot of about 8 years ago. The Gaia hypothesis that he put forward, that Lovelock put forward with some other scientists whose names I'm forgetting in the 70s, essentially is that the Earth is a living organism, right? That the ancient concept of Gaia, in fact, has some scientific merit. Not living in the sense that it is sustaining as an organism the same way that you or I are, but alive in that it has a state of homeostatic feedback that is constantly in operation, that interactions between systems on our planet are far more complex than we could ever imagine. A classic example of this is the argument that Lovelock puts forward, which has since been sort of observed to be more or less correct, is a rainforest like the Amazon, in fact, by the accumulation of the density of trees, summons its own rain. That it actually, the forest produces the conditions that allow it to continue to exist as a rainforest. And there's this sort of cycle happening here that's devilishly complex. And I think that returning to that, not to go maybe full Gaia hypothesis, but it does point towards at least a critical position that we can take towards environmental phenomena to say our habitual concept of what is meaningful and what isn't is something that we might revise. Caleb.
I know you said that you were coming to the end of this, but...
Well, I was just going to the end of that sentence.
Right, yeah, but... oh, well, okay. So along those lines, I'm wondering if you have an answer to this, because you kind of alluded in your talk that there might be some resistance to describing Sferics as mystic. You did talk about an artist who...
Yeah.
So is the resistance, within that subculture, or is it imposed on them, or and if it is, is it because of this idea that it is hokey?
Thank you for that, Caleb. I think just to clarify a little bit, the moment where I think you're talking about is with Dan Tapper's work, with a piece like Recording the Spirit Level, simultaneously making a kind of claim towards the sort of mysticism of Sferics, while also in his own practice as an artist. I wanted to honor the fact that as an artist he goes to great lengths to make sure that other artists know that this is a kind of thing they can do too, right? There's a kind of educational capacity there in order to make it not seem like this is just another thing that like a particular kind of nerd gets to do and the rest of us can't figure it out because it's way too complicated, right? So he does a lot of work in terms of breaking down different kinds of, also like financially accessible techniques. Because really, if you want to listen to Sferics at home, all you need, like having a WR3 helps. And like I said, that's about, altogether that setup's about $200. If you could also take a hula hoop. I'm going to tell you too. You take a hula hoop, you feed through the hula hoop about 12 to 20 passes of copper wire. You take that copper wire and you solder on a little 3.5-inch headphone jack like we used to have on our phones, and then you just plug that into a speaker. That's all you need, right? So the demystification, I think, kind of happens on that register. I will say that I think maybe what you're also detecting is my own resistance to framing, or at the very least, I'm interested from a sort of position of critique why Sferics and similar kinds of sounds habitually get talked about as sublime, divine, ghostly, apparitional, what have you. It makes total sense why they're this weird thing that's around us at all times that you can only use, we've all seen Poltergeist, and if you haven't seen Poltergeist, you need to see Poltergeist. We've been using this. I think about something like, there's Jeffrey Sconce's Haunted Media book, which is a really wonderful book that talks about how from the earliest stages of any new media technology, people are always trying to use them to talk to the dead, right?
Yeah, the Ari.
Exactly. And we have this with the telegraph, with radio, with everything, right? And this is no different, right? So I totally get it. I'm also just interested in that habitual pose, and I'm interested in sort of even just maybe in my own natural radio listening practice, right? Because there is a sort of moment where I sort of play the artist in this, right? I'm interested in what's the next step? If they're not ghosts, how else do we talk about them? How else can we think about them? So I think that's kind of my position there. Yeah, Caitlin?
I just wanted to know, does the natural radio community talk to the astronomical radio community? Because I know planets make similar sounds. I feel like there's more emphasis on that, and it might be going back to your point about these other worlds, colonial mindset of
yeah. That's really interesting. I'm really glad you brought, because that's not necessarily a frame I had thought about, but I would absolutely. We should talk more about that.
Yeah.
My sort of straightforward answer to your question is yes. There's very much at the end of the day, I'm gonna just make a rough total guesstimate of the number of people worldwide who probably have listened to natural radio with any regularity or even at all. If we say at all, it's in the 4 digits. Probably, maybe 5. It's not, we're talking about a really, really small community, right? Ultimately speaking. And a lot of them are people who work at NASA, right? Yeah. So they're definitely thinking about, and there's also, to be clear, while there's not, I made the point in the talk that there's not scientific or industrial use for spherics. There's a little bit. It's mostly around lightning detection. One thing that I cut from the paper was there's a number of... So I have no idea if UMD subscribes to it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does. There are a number of companies in the United States that offer lightning detection services. One's called Earth Networks, and one's called, like, Valsalva or something. And they're... Because NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA and the NWS, the National Weather Service, they don't maintain sort of their own lightning detection networks. They have subcontractors that are these two companies that use various radios throughout throughout the country they listen to spherics, and then what they do is if you have at least 3 sensors. One sensor alone, if it hits a sphere, if a spheric comes from it, you have no idea where it comes from, right? It could come from anywhere, right? But if you then catch it on 2 more sensors, you can then use that to triangulate the origin point of the sound of the electromagnetic impulse, and you can get about a 15-minute warning of whether or not a lightning storm is about to hit everyone on the soccer pitch, right? So there are some uses, to be clear, and there's a number of research scientists who are interested in natural radio and are exploring it on a number of different registers. And I would imagine that many of them are dovetailing with their their colleagues over in, like, astronomical and planetary science. In terms of, like, actual listening practices, I'm not sure. It would be worthwhile looking up, certainly.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Hema, did I see your hand?
Yeah. I just had, like, a small question.
Of course.
So in your process of reading and research, I know, so my sense of it is that the knowledge of what specifically spherics are might be narrower than the idea or the imagination of spherics.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering if you came across, like, allusions and just references to spherics without necessarily, maybe they weren't calling them that, maybe it was before they called them that, but just imaginations of them.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. The short answer is I haven't, mostly because I hadn't thought to look for precisely that kind of thing. I also where I think we would find it predominantly. I mean, so there's on the one hand the concept of the music of the spheres and the idea of the planet making sound is an ancient one, right? Obviously. And I do know, glancingly, I would have to do a little bit more digging, which I just haven't done yet, that I believe that there are some Inuit or Inupiaq traditions in the places where there are aurora, right? Of the aurora having some kind of sonic signature, right? Whether or not that's something that's directly perceived or a part of a sort of larger cultural tradition, I can't say one way or the other. That might be kind of a moment there. But then, otherwise, the question really comes down to the necessity of technical mediation in order to access the sounds at all, right? Which is to say that I think that the majority of what you would probably hear as references to spherics are going to be from those early stages of telegraphy and telephony, right? And I know, for instance, Douglas Kahn's book, Earth Sound, Earth Signal, is full of little anecdotes of telegraph operators and telephone operators getting really, really pissed off because the spherics were really loud that day, right? But it's not, it's the sort of moment where, telephony and telegraphy had only been in existence for a decade or two, right? It's already a kind of miracle of a technology. Exactly the source of the interference is unknown, right? So then that knowledge gets refined later on and we figure out how to shield cables and so on and so forth. But I would look principally maybe in those kinds of, like, 2 widely distinct traditions. The first is, any kind of culture that is around aurora, given that aurora are sort of like clearest access point into the magnetosphere in the absence of technical mediation. And then on the other hand, those first few decades of telephony and telegraphy, to see the kinds of stories that people were telling about all of these sounds that they were hearing. So I know that we are at 6:35. Do we have any? Yes, absolutely. I'll stay. I'll keep asking questions as long as you want. My question was going to be about if there's anyone on any questions from online.
They're just happy and clapping.
I love that. Keep clapping, and I'll keep answering else. Yes.
Very interesting talk. So I'm actually an atmospheric scientist.
Wonderful.
Studying lightning.
I'm really, really glad that someone showed up from the outside of the school. I was really hoping.
So I work closely with Glassela and Earth Networks.
Wonderful.
And my dissertation actually was about all the lightning data. So my question is, are you only listening, or are you actually doing some quantitative measurement of the Sferics and trying to, I guess, correlate with the lightning data or the weather data?
Yeah, so my position, the answer is only listening. My position as a media studies person is that I'm mostly interested in this is sort of why I wanted the focus of the talk is sort of focused mostly on the media arts, right? Is I'm interested in sort of the cultural production that gets made out of these noises and the various kinds of practices and cultures of their listening. In terms of doing like actual correlative work, that is just outside of my training and outside of my scope. I do in my work as a digital humanist, I've done sort of some quantitative projects, but my focus sort of as a researcher tends to be more on the qualitative.
Are you considering that?
It's not necessarily a part of where I see this project going forward next. What I see sort of as a next stage for this project, obviously there's the article that's sort of like, yay, that's going to happen. But I see this also as the book project that I'm working on, Cloud Studies, is currently organized around each level of the atmosphere as a chapter and sort of different kinds of cultural media arts projects that deal with sort of the capacity in each of those atmospheric layers of sort of producing information and the concept of information. And so I very much see this as the thermosphere ionosphere chapter is going to be this. And this also dovetails a lot with my dissertation work, which I did here at Maryland. That was a book project, a sort of preliminary book project called Atmospheric Media, which was mapping similar kinds of terrain, but none of this work specifically. This is all new. Thank you. I'm really glad that someone came over here from. I was really hoping. So that really warms my heart. Do we have any more questions? Yes, Sky, take us home. Please.
Well, I'm really struck by like the inherent tension between human and the environment that's brought up through Sferics and like the listening practice. So, like you said, they require technology to listen, yet the technology and modernity are working against your ability to hear them. Like very inherent there. The political is deeply embedded in the history of Sferics just by nature of them, their discovery during World War I in the trenches, and like that seems to haunt their whole trajectory and how our relationship with them. And I guess it kind of begs the question in a way, like you're talking about interference and noise. Are we as humans in a way the interference or the noise in their, natural progression of things, and are we inserting ourselves in a way in trying to even grapple or hear or understand?
You always ask the really good questions. Thank you for that one. I think that. So what I first want to say is also talking a little bit more about why it's so hard to hear Sferics here in this room. You wouldn't be able to hear them in the room. You could and folks are welcome to afterwards if you want to listen in the WR3. You will hear a loud, booming hum and nothing but that. And that is the hum of electricity. We use alternating current predominantly in this country, right? And alternating current has a cycle of the current going one direction and the current going another direction. And the cycle of that hertz, that oscillation, produces a hum that you hear that is smack dab in the middle. In the middle of where VLF is, drowns it out entirely. So this is why, and they travel quite far, the hum. When we were out in Schaefer Farms, we were about, I calculated we were about a mile and a half away from a power line, and we still heard the hum. It was faint, but we still heard it. So I think this sort of underscores your point, Skye, that about how the very sort of armature of human technical infrastructure is interfering with our ability to access these sounds. I've gone back and forth on whether or not, like, humanity is an imposition on Sferics. Certainly, we have influenced the electromagnetic life of this planet. And I think, to return to Marissa's question, we see that in something as straightforward as bird migration, right? That cell phone towers and other kinds of electrical infrastructure have thrown off migratory routes because of the interference that we produce. Whether or not those animals are tuning in directly to, like, VLF frequencies, like if lightning is meaningful at all to them, we can only speculate. And to a further point, we also can sort of only speculate about whether or not our interference in the VLF spectrum, like, ultimately, like, to our current knowledge, the Earth as a planet is not, right, it's not cognitive, it doesn't sort of have it has a life that we can disrupt, but it's not one that maps onto sort of, like, our understanding of life as we're alive, right? Nevertheless, I think that your point is very much well taken, that electromagnetism is a space that humanity is having an impact of some kind in various registers in various ways. And this is maybe a sort of, like, activist position, one that I'm fairly comfortable taking, right? That this work helps point in a small way to the reality of human impacts on the planet's electromagnetic life, which are often too easily discounted because we don't imagine ourselves to be able to sense it, we don't see it, it's not there, right? This is that kind of, like, sensible bias that we see even in the choice of what we choose to study, sometimes in environmental media studies, right? There's more work happening now on electromagnetism, right? Like Mukherjee's work with the radiant infrastructure stuff that I talked about earlier he's sort of, like, on the vanguard of this in a lot of ways, but it's a relatively understudied space. And I think sort of concomitantly and similarly here, it points to that kind of potential activist agenda. Thank you.
I think we'll wrap it up.
So we will wrap it up. I have been asked by Liz to do two. I'm going to say two things, and then I want to say one thing that Liz doesn't know that I'm going to say. The first is this has been our first series of digital dialogues back since 2020. This is what she doesn't know I'm going to say. First, just a round of applause for Liz for helping coordinate all of this. She's there in the back, folks. The second is that calls for nominations for our next season of digital dialogues are circulating. I believe they've been sent out on Myths and AADHum's socials and listservs. They'll go out if they haven't yet already. So if you listening at home or here have anyone who works in the digital humanities or digital studies broadly construed that you would love to see come here to give a talk just like this one, please go ahead and put their name in the bucket. Because we want to make sure that we're building a season of talks that are really responsive to our community's needs. And the second thing is another event that we're going to be running here in Myth on Friday. I'm actually teaching a class called Archaeologies of Gaming and Electronic Literature that has been working with our vintage software and hardware collections here at Myth. And my wonderful, wonderful students have put together a series of really lovely exhibits using the materials here at Myth on a range of different kinds of really cool topics. So if you want to come on Friday, this Friday at noon, here to Myth, we're going to have a gallery opening where you can see and play with a number of our vintage holdings. We will also have falafel, and that's what's most important. So thank you all again. Those are my announcements. I'm done now.